Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today on another episode of Moving Markets. My name is Jeffrey Dunyan. If you're watching this on video instead of just listening, right as I started, you saw me suddenly push my chair back away from the computer. Charlie horse, I had to suddenly stretch my leg. What a great way to start our podcast today. I got to tell you, it's exciting stuff. As of just a minute or two ago, the U.S. markets are officially closed. I should mention before we get too far into this, this episode of Moving Markets is brought to you by Safe Option Strategies. If you want to learn how to safely and effectively trade the U.S. markets, not a get-rich-quick thing, but how to put your money to work for you and do it in the safest way possible and still benefit from the markets, check us out at sostrades.com. Safe Option Strategies at sostrades.com. All right, so last week, if you were with us listening to last week's podcast, we talked about the upcoming Fed meeting that took place last week. When Wednesday came, Jerome Powell announced that the Fed would pause, not raise rates on this, at this particular meeting. But then he did something that I was not expecting. Now, even though I wasn't expecting it, I brought it up as a possibility last week. I said there is a possibility that he says we're going to pause and then definitively says that we're going to do another rate hike next time. That's not quite what he did, but it's not too far off the mark. So Powell said, we're going to pause, but we are definitely going to do 2 more rate hikes before the end of this year. And there is no possibility that we are going to pivot and decrease rates. Now, I mentioned that he had a tight needle he was going to try and thread. He was going to try to appease the hawks and the doves and say something that wouldn't shake the markets too badly, but I don't think he's concerned if he shakes the markets a little bit and in a temporary way. But what surprised me was not the pause, even though, and I'm here to eat a little bit of crow. I told you last week that I expected them to raise rates. I thought Jerome Powell was going to be so afraid of being like Paul Volcker back in the 70s and so afraid of a repeat of what happened in the 70s that he was going to raise rates. Markets be darned, who cares? So I was on the wrong side of that. I was in that minority, 20 or 25% of people who thought he would raise rates. Obviously, all of you and all of those who thought he would raise rates were right. Would pause. Those of you who thought he was going to pause were correct. But he did something that to me was far more shocking than pausing, and that is he, in my opinion, got way too specific about what he's going to do in the future. And the risk he runs in doing that is painting himself into a corner. He said very definitively, we're going to raise rates 2 more times this year. He didn't say it would be at the next Fed meeting. He didn't say it would be at the one after that. I think there's 4 more Fed meetings after the one that they just had last week. So it's got to be 2 of those 4. Maybe he pauses one meeting, raises rates the next, pauses one meeting, raises rates the next, or maybe he pauses a couple more meetings and then raises towards the end of the year. I don't know what's going to happen there. But again, I think he's painted himself into a little bit of a corner by even saying that. The other thing he said was, I don't know that he painted himself into a corner as much on this. He put to rest the speculation that there's going to be a pivot and there's going to be rate decreases this year. He's never said there would be decreases. A lot of people have speculated that the market would or that the Fed would pivot sometime this year, and that we would see interest rates come down before the end of the year. Powell has never indicated that would be the case. He's never even hinted toward or suggested that might be a possibility. But he really shut the door on that when he spoke last week. He said, and I'm paraphrasing. I don't have the text of his comments right in front of me, so I'm paraphrasing. But he essentially said, everyone who thinks we're going to lower rates before the end of this year, we don't know where you're getting that from. It's never been part of the plan. He said definitively we're not going to do that. And the combination of saying that there would be two more rate hikes, along with this really hard definitive notion that that we will not pivot, and we will not decrease rates before the end of this year. Those two things in conjunction with each other, I thought would have created a big sell-off. There was a sell-off a little bit on the Dow. I think the Nasdaq and the S&P both ended up in positive territory. The Dow Jones Industrial Average ended up a couple hundred points down, but well off its low of the session. Now, this goes back to Wednesday when he made these comments. The next day was the biggest surprise. Thursday, there was an incredible market rally. It wasn't on massive volume. The Dow Jones did not trade last week Thursday on real huge volume. The S&P 500 was very average volume. The Nasdaq was maybe fractionally higher than average volume, but all three indexes were up Thursday, and they were up a pretty good percentage. They made a pretty big move up, and that's when a lot of people were scratching their heads. I think every financial talking head that I listened to during the day on Thursday was perplexed, and that's putting it kind of mildly. Some were outright shocked that the markets were reacting this way. The only thing I was able to figure out, and I shared this with some of the members of Safe Option Strategies when we were doing one of our live presentations in the morning that's for all the members of our program. The only thing I was able to share with them as in terms of some explanation was that the markets don't react well to uncertainty, and Powell did give just a little bit of certainty. He basically said what they're going to do as far as rate increases go, and he put to bed this notion that they're going to decrease rates, and a favorable reaction from the markets in terms of having that certainty and being a little more comfortable with what's going to happen going forward. Only explanation I can think of, only explanation I can give as to why the markets were up on Thursday. And even that to me was a stretch. I felt like that's kind of what I could figure out was going on, but it still didn't seem right. It still seemed like with the news that he gave, the market should be reacting the other way. I mentioned to all of the members of Safe Option Strategies on Friday morning that I believed before Friday was over, the markets would roll over. Friday started out to the upside. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, the Nasdaq, the S&P, in the early part of the trading session on Friday, they were all in positive territory and looked like they might be building on Thursday's gains. That all flipped on its head on Friday, and all three indexes sold off, and not in a crazy wild way. The S&P wasn't down dramatically. The Dow finished towards its session lows, but that wasn't a huge dip from where it was closing out the day before. And the Nasdaq, probably percentage wise and in terms of where it moved during the day, it probably had the biggest percentage sell off on the heaviest volume, and still wasn't a horrible day. It wasn't like one of these bloodbath days where everything is just crashing unexpectedly and inexplicably. But I mentioned to all of our members that I believe before the day was over or first part of this week that the markets would roll over and you would start to see the sell-off. I think the buying that took place on Thursday was not justified. I think it was the wrong move to make for the markets, and it pushed the S&P, it pushed the Nasdaq, and I believe the Dow as well. No, I'm sorry, not the Dow, but the S&P and the Nasdaq both were pushed farther into overbought territory. If you're looking at an RSI indicator as an indication of whether the markets are overbought or oversold, it pushed them a little deeper into that overbought territory on the Nasdaq and the S&P. And sure enough, before the day was over, everything was trading to the downside, and all three indexes finished towards the lows of the session. At the close of the market today, which took place just a short time ago, the Dow officially finished down 245 points. That's a little less than 0.75%. The S&P finished down almost 21 points. That's not quite 0.5%. The Nasdaq spent a little bit of the afternoon in positive territory. Most of the day it spent to the downside, but a little bit of time in positive territory, and ended up finishing down only, I believe, 16. I had it in front of me a moment ago and it just disappeared, but finished down 16/100%, about 22 points and some change. So not a massive ugly sell-off, not a brutal sell-off by any stretch, but certainly adding on to Friday's sell-off and more rational movement in the market. It just simply became what I would consider more rational moves for what the market should be doing. I expect that sell-off to continue this week. That doesn't mean that there couldn't be 1 or 2 days. It's a holiday shortened week. We didn't have any trading yesterday because of the Juneteenth holiday in the U.S. markets. I believe that we could have maybe not a massive sell-off, but a continuation to the downside this week. One of the biggest things going on this week in terms of news and events and things that could move the markets is Jerome Powell will be speaking tomorrow and Thursday. And I believe this is his semi-annual or quarterly report that he makes to Congress. He'll actually be meeting in front of Congress and giving a report on the economy from his perspective. He's going to be asked questions. This is where members of I believe the House of Representatives are going to be able to ask him questions about what his plans are and what he thinks is going to go on. And Powell has a tendency to step in it a little bit. He's his, I would say he's his own worst enemy, but I'm going to put it a different way. I think he is really his only enemy, not just his own worst enemy, but his only enemy. He has a tendency to step in it. He has a tendency to talk too much and not be ambiguous enough about what his plans are and what's going to go on. So it'll be interesting to see what happens as a result of him testifying tomorrow and Thursday. I think he's going to be asked about his decision to raise rates a couple more times this year and maybe give some more clarity on when that might happen and to what degree that might happen, although that's a hard thing to predict because circumstances could change and he could have to go a different direction. I think also this notion that he's not going to reverse and lower rates before the end of the year. I think he'll be pressed on that a little bit as well. So going to be interesting to hear him. Of course, the jobs number, the unemployment numbers will come out on Thursday as they always do. And then PMI, some manufacturing numbers, the manufacturing index will be out on Friday. That always has the ability to move the markets a little bit if that's a really good or a really bad report. Kind of just one more of those gauges in terms of the health of the economy. So those were basically, I nailed the first two things I wanted to talk about: the reaction to the Fed announcement, and then what is going on as we move farther into this week. The last thing I want to talk about in today's podcast, a little bit different. Early this morning, when the markets were just about ready to open, it came across the ticker, the banners on the different news channels that you were on, that Hunter Biden had reached a plea deal with the Department of Justice for, I believe, 2 misdemeanor failure to file taxes or failure to disclose taxes or something like that, and 1 misdemeanor lying on a gun application charge. Look, I don't make a secret of where my politics are. I don't mind that people know I'm very conservative in my politics. I try not to be offensive about it. I try not to alienate anybody who's on the other side of the political aisle. I wish there were more. I wish more of us could disagree politically and still get along and still be friends. I really do. I mean that sincerely. So I try not to mix politics into too much of what I do, or if I mix the politics in, I try and talk about it from the perspective of how is this going to affect the markets. I don't think the Hunter Biden story in and of itself is going to affect the markets at all, but I think you have to be pretty naive to think that he did not get, because of his family name, because of political connections, you have to see that he got a deal that most other people would not get. If I had brought in the kind of money that he brought in, even if I had done it legally, and I believe he did it incredibly illegally, but if I had brought in that kind of money and failed to pay taxes or file tax returns on it, I would go to jail most likely, or I would be in some really serious trouble. If I had lied on a gun application, specifically about drug addiction and crack addiction, I'd probably be in jail. And the sad truth is there are people who have committed lesser crimes than what Hunter Biden was accused of and than what he committed, who are sitting in jail right now. Now, like I said, I don't think this story in and of itself is going to have an effect on what the markets do. I don't think the reason the Dow was down today is because Hunter Biden got a sweetheart deal. I don't think the markets were down because people feel like a grave injustice took place. But if you've been in the stock market for any amount of time as an individual investor, you always hear people talking about how the game is rigged. Lately, there's been a lot of talk, largely because of some high-profile politicians who have made millions and millions of dollars in the stock market while in a political office. Nancy Pelosi and her husband are multimillionaires and have a history of making the perfect move in the market just before a piece of legislation is voted on or announced. I mean, it's a different form, but it is absolutely insider information. And this is not a Democrat or Republican thing. There are Republicans getting rich off of this as well. I can't remember her name right now because she's just simply not as high profile as Nancy Pelosi or Dianne Feinstein, who's also had her net worth go up 10 times over since being a senator, which doesn't, when you think about the experience that most politicians bring to office, what they've done in their career prior to being a politician, the actual salary for a senator, the actual salary for a congressperson is not real high relative to what they could make in the private sector. Now, there's a lot of perks, and it's the power, I think, more than the money that attracts them to the position. It's the ego that makes them want to be there, sadly, for most of them, far more than trying to look for good things to do for their country. And again, I think that's on both sides of the political aisle as well. But there's members of Congress trying to get bills passed that prohibit any sitting congressman or congresswoman or any sitting member of the Senate from being able to have them or their immediate family trade stocks at all, like at all, because it is a very rigged game. The thing that bothers me the most, and I'm bothered on a lot of levels, but again, I'm going to mostly keep my politics to myself. The thing that stings the most about the Hunter Biden situation, it's one more example of the plutocracy that exists in this country. The rich people in politics continue to get richer. They continue to get sweetheart deals. They have unfair advantages over the rest of us that should not be there. Politics has become too much of a money-making game. And when you see what happened with Hunter Biden today, I mean, he got off the hook because his last name is Biden, because his dad's the president, because the mainstream press and most of the people that reside in Washington, D.C., that are part of the bureaucracy there will do anything, however unscrupulous, however immoral, they'll do almost anything to protect the people that they like, the people whose politics line up with theirs. Both sides of the political aisle do that to a degree, and it's unfair to all of the rest of us. I think what the Hunter Biden situation today has to do with the markets is that it's just this awful, horrible reminder that we don't have a level playing field compared to the politicians and the wealthy people in Washington, D.C., whether their wealth is all monetary or some combination of money and power. They control things or have control over things or have insider information that the rest of us don't have. And it makes it tougher to do what we do. And that's what bothers me about this situation. Now, is it going to change what I do in the markets? No. Is it going to Am I going to wallow in this feeling of unfairness? No, there's still ways to make money in the stock market, and there's still a lot of money to be made. But whatever side of politics you're on, if you're super strong liberal, if you're super strong conservative, if you're a libertarian that wants the government 100% out of every aspect of our lives, if you're part of a Green Party or socialist or communist, I do care if you're socialist or communist. I wish we had no place for that at all in our country. But whatever your politics are, you should be bothered by the fact that politically connected people get away with and do things that the rest of us cannot get away with and do. That's bad for everybody in the country except those few privileged people that are in a position to take advantage of that. Hunter Biden should be in jail no matter who his dad is right now, no matter what family connections he has. He should be in jail right now. There are other politicians on both sides of the political aisle that should be in jail for things that they've done that they've quite frankly just gotten away with. It's a sad commentary for the entire country when someone politically connected like that can get a deal like that and avoid what would happen to the rest of us. So as far as I'm concerned, it's one more black eye to this administration, one more black eye to the country. And I love this country. I'm a patriot as much as anything else. I'm a patriot and I love this country. And I hate to see what's happening to the political class. I detest career politicians. Again, it has nothing to do with the markets. I realize I'm off topic a little bit as far as a direct connection to the stock markets. But the best thing we could do for this country is get rid of career politicians, put term limits in place, not let anyone for any reason, whether elected or whether appointed to an office, not allow anyone to spend more than 12 years in Washington, D.C. under any circumstances. You want to be a senator for 2 terms? Fine. When you're done, you leave Washington, D.C. and you never go back in any type of office, appointee or otherwise. You want to be president for a couple of terms? Fine. You can spend a couple years in Congress before you do that. Maybe be a governor of your state before you do that. 12 years is the most time anyone should spend in Washington, D.C., in Congress, in the Senate, in the president's office, or as a political appointee. For any of those administrations. Anyways, I'm going to get off that soapbox now. Listen, I'm expecting a bearish week this week. I think before we get to the end of the day on Friday, we're going to be down for the week. It's going to negate, last week was the best week the stock market has had, I think, since 1 week in March. So the best week definitely for 3 or 4 months. I think this week you're going to see the opposite of that. Not necessarily like the worst week we've seen in 6 months, but I think you're going to see a retracement to some degree, and be protected, be hedged, because that's the safest way to be in the market. Thanks everybody for joining us for another episode of Moving Markets Podcast. We'll see you back here next week on Monday. Hope you have a great week. Bye-bye.